WDET in Detroit, this is The Metro. I'm Tia Graham.
And I'm Cary Junior II in for Robin Vincent.
Today on the program, a new magazine wants to bring life back to editorial writing with a Detroit flair. We'll learn more about Divine Magazine.
Plus, a hiccup in the clerk's office means all the candidates running for the community advisory councils will have to run write-in campaigns. We'll discuss how that happened.
And it's that time of the year for summer outdoor activities. Later on the show, we'll learn all about this year's Ann Arbor Art Fair.
Also, how are landfills built to keep the waste from harming our environment? But first, on Wednesday, a judge is set to decide whether low-level radioactive material left over from the creation of the first atomic bomb can find its forever home in a Metro Detroit landfill. New York wants to send about 6,000 cubic yards of tainted soil and 4,000 gallons of contaminated groundwater to a waste disposal site near Belleville. It's one of a handful in the country licensed to dispose that kind of waste. Communities near the site, including Canton Township, filed a lawsuit to stop shipments of the toxic material from New York. WDET's Quinn Klinefelter spoke with Canton Township Supervisor Anne Marie Graham-Hudak. She says the suit kept those remnants of the Manhattan Project out of Michigan so far, but not other contaminated material.
So at this time, we still have this kind of waste coming into Michigan, whether it be into the injection well in Romulus or into Wayne Disposal. So it is unfortunately still coming, but we're hoping this helps us launch some precedents to stop that.
But the specific one from New York has not come yet.
It has not come. No, and it was supposed to start coming basically in January. So we're glad that we were able to stop it. We met with the judge. The hearing was in May, and the judge is scheduled to make the ruling on July 2nd. We hope that happens. We've been working also with Senator Darren Camilleri and Rep. Reggie Miller. They have two bills that are going to increase tipping fees, amongst many other things. Basically, our tipping fees are one of the lowest in the nation. We're basically at 36 cents a ton. So we're just basically inviting people to come dump into Michigan. Other states, you're looking at $13 a ton. That just exasperates what we already have. And at some point, our landfills will be full, and we will be looking for other places. Canton landfill maybe has 5 years left. The EPA were saying that this was safe. And our question was, if this is so safe, why is it being moved? Why don't you just mitigate it in place? And that's still what we're questioning. But radioactive waste in the body is absorbed, and it's additive. So if you live near there, that's a problem. Also, Michigan has 21% of the world's fresh water. And so we're putting this in an area, well, there's a dense area. You've got schools nearby, groundwater, which takes it out to the Rouge River, which takes it to the Detroit River, which takes it out to the Great Lakes. So why are we looking at even putting it there? It's also, what they're going to do is they call it burritos. So they would wrap the waste in these plastic burritos and then come here and bury it so many feet, and then they put a cap on it. But they could not guarantee even that the plastic they're going to wrap it in is going to even match the half-life of some of this radioactive dirt that they have. I'm a retired engineer. One of the things that I worked on before I left Ford Motor Company was electromagnetic radiation. And that was actually one of my favorite classes in college. And they can't guarantee how this waste will stay encompassed in this plastic. There's no test on this plastic that have been done to that. And again, their guidelines, I think their guidelines are way too narrow. But you're going to keep dumping it, which makes it additive, and it doesn't go away. It's a constant radiation.
So you actually don't trust what the agencies or the company are saying about this?
Correct. I do not trust it. I think some of the guidelines that have been made in Michigan especially are leaning more towards companies. We're an automotive area, and we know that we've got PFAS. We know that in the early days, automotive companies would dump wherever they did. I know that there's brownfields for reasons because companies dumped. And I really, really believe that we are contaminated. And I think in Michigan, our guidelines are way too low. I think they protect companies more than they do our residents. This is a public health issue. It really is.
So what remedy would you be seeking at this point now?
The remedy I would be seeking is that we stop this. Darren Camilleri's bill actually states that also. He says we just stop everything from coming in. We do more studies and more testing. We do not allow any more radioactive waste to come into Michigan. We do not allow any more new sites to be established. I know a lot of the businesses are concerned about this, but if you look at it, even hospitals, hospitals generate radioactive waste. You do x-rays, you do MRIs and things like that. So how do we mitigate in place what we have instead of transporting it? I don't think we should be transporting it. Quit thinking about kicking things down the road, saying, hey, we're just going to keep doing this. We're going to keep making nuclear reactors and we'll just keep burying it, not really thinking about what's going to happen in the future. I think that we've done that for too long. I just think we have done things too haphazardly, and I think our limits need to be looked at. I think that they're more pro-business than they are pro-public health. That is my biggest concern.
So that's what you would hope and seek to have happen. You've been dealing with this issue for a while now. Do you think that that's within the realms of reality?
I think if we want it to be more in the business of reality, it can be. I don't think that...
Who's we? You, the officials, the townspeople, the agencies?
I definitely think the townspeople. I definitely think the mayors and the supervisors and the townspeople. That's why we have this injunction. And that's why we're trying to push this legislation through, yes. I think the U.S. Chamber needs to take a look at things a little bit more in terms of... If you even think of just the tipping fees, let's just talk about the tipping fees to try to stop it. I mean, they're saying, they don't agree with that. But we're just a dumping state based on 36 cents a ton.
If the company comes back and says, well, we're licensed to do this, as you say, hospitals and places keep making this kind of material. It's got to go somewhere. This place is allowed to take it. We've got to put it somewhere, so why not here? How do you answer back?
My answer is that we need to study this even more. And I can understand in Michigan, what do we do with Michigan's waste where this is happening? But taking outside waste, it just gives us less space to figure out what to do with our own. But it also is in a densely populated area. There is an interstate commerce that does not allow us to stop. There has to be a constitutional change on the federal level also, because this is considered, trading commerce and money.
On this entire topic, have you ever had much reaction back from the federal government, no matter which administration was running it at the time?
Not really. They keep pointing to the Interstate Commerce Clause. And I think, obviously, people always say it's hard to change a constitution and it will never happen. But look what happened with, the Supreme Court just changed some things that were in the Constitution for 50 years, So I think it's a possibility. I think the need is there. The want has to make it happen.
That was Canton Township Supervisor Anne Marie Graham-Hudak talking with WDET reporter and senior editor Quinn Klinefelter. Quinn is here with me right now. Quinn, welcome back to the Metro. Good to have you this morning.
Good to be here.
So we just heard your conversation with the Canton Township Supervisor about preventing radioactive soil and water from New York from getting into Michigan landfills. So the question of toxic materials being shipped into Michigan came up with the East Palestine, Ohio train derailment in 2023. The pileup of rail cars carrying chemicals like hydrogen chloride burned for days, and the cleanup took even longer. So part of that cleanup, though, meant putting contaminated waste back onto trains and shipping it here. What was the reaction to that?
Shock and dismay and rather anger, as well as a realization that there was not a heck of a lot people could do about it. To be honest, under the current rules that the Wayne disposal site operates under, and the company that has that, the government, the Army Corps of Engineers that will move some of the radioactive waste and some of the other ones, as well as the train company that was clearing East Palestine in the example you're talking about, they don't have to tell any of the officials. They have to inform the state regulatory people that it's coming, and that's that. That floored people like Congresswoman Debbie Dingell and Warren Evans and just a number of other people when the East Palestine situation happened, and it was such big news. And then to realize that this material was being sent to Belleville or Romulus in that area, that just threw them for a loop that they weren't even informed. So that was one of the things. In fact, this whole situation has that kind of a thread through it, that people want to be informed that this is coming, and yet the company is not violating anything, or the government, for that matter, is not violating anything by not telling them because they're not required to do so.
So only like the state knows, but not the people in Canton Township, the people who are local to the actual area where the landfill is.
Yeah, and
Wow.
It would have been the same situation there was actually with this material that they are stopping that came from the Manhattan Project, which was the first attempt successful to make an atomic bomb back in the World War II era. But there's other sites that have some of the Manhattan Project material, reportedly, that are already still sending radioactive stuff to Michigan, to some of the landfills, that particular landfill here. There's only about, I think, 5 or so in the country that are licensed to handle it. And Michigan happens to be closer to New York, number one. And number two, they have what we heard the Canton Township Supervisor refer to as tipping fees. And that's one of the big draws for dumping in Michigan.
Because it's cheaper.
Yeah, way cheaper. I mean, as she was saying, it was roughly, they'll charge like 36 cents for every ton that you dump. It's not for sure, but people think they call it a tipping fee because it's like the back of a dump truck is tipping backwards and dumping it all in. And so, so for like every ton, they'll charge 36 cents in Michigan. Other states, just on average, will charge $13 per ton. So, and they set it up that way back in the old days. Michigan officials, they thought it was going to be a revenue generator to bring in more trash. And so they had wanted it to be cheaper. And now it's to a point where these landfills are filling up rapidly. And in fact, we from what I was able to research, have maybe one of our biggest customers, if not the biggest, bringing this kind of material in, just stuff to landfills in general, not necessarily radioactive, is coming from Canada.
Right.
You know, and so that's been one of our big customers.
I see.
I don't know if there's any trash tariffs. I probably shouldn't talk loud just in case some might pop up out of nowhere.
Well, what I want to get to, though, is there's something about this story that stands out. It's about how many elected officials are in lockstep with residents saying that they don't want them to send the material to their area. So if residents and elected officials are raising these alarms, why is the toxic waste still coming even if there's so much pushback?
Because there is only a handful allowed to take it.
I see.
And because the current rules and regulations that the state has and the federal government has, the company that runs Wayne Disposal is meeting all of them. They're not violating any standards by bringing this in. They're technically allowed to do so. And they will stress that, I mean, they stress that in the arguments over this lawsuit, that they're not doing anything wrong. The arguments on the other side that the township supervisors in Romulus and Belleville have said is that it could pose a public hazard, one, and that people should be informed, which is something that they'll need to change the rules and regulations in order to make it be a requirement. There's also some other things, too, because there are fears environmentally. The fire chief in one of the cities actually joined part of the lawsuit because they say they're not trained to handle anything if, in fact, there was kind of a radioactive-based fire that developed at one of these landfills, and they don't have the necessary equipment or anything to try to put it out. As the township supervisor was saying, this is a densely populated area that's close to waterways where any of this that would potentially leak into the groundwater would have a good chance of maybe getting into the Detroit River or getting out into the Great Lakes and spoiling some of the only fresh water resources that we have in the U.S.
Now, that's an interesting point you bring here because you talk about how the people are dumping here based off of, like, they're abiding by the rules, right? We only have a couple minutes left, but I want you to briefly talk about, if you can, are there any rules then that include the potential health hazards, the potential pollution that this stuff can cause in those areas that would then give more credence to the complaints that the local officials and the residents are saying? Well,
not according to the Army Corps of Engineers or the company or the state's agency, Eagle, the environmental arm of the Michigan government. They say that the company's meeting all those standards and that they had safety of the public health in mind when they were made. Now, officials like the township supervisor, like Warren Evans, others, have flat out said they don't trust what these agencies are saying. It's coming to a head, actually, to a point later this summer. Because the other aspect of this, and I know we have only a short minute, but the company itself has been operating for a couple of years under a temporarily extended license. Its license has been up for renewal, but hasn't been renewed for the last couple of years. They are drafting what the new requirements should look like in terms of what the state wants to have done, and they will have a public comment on what their plan is one way or the other. Every time, as you say, that the public has had a town hall or anything, they have, blown their collective lid over what's coming. So what will be the case to see is how much the lids are blown, so to speak, when this final plan comes out for renewing this company's license.
And whether we'll get some regulations on that to help with the residents and what the public officials there are saying. Yeah. All right, Quinn Klinefelter. He's a reporter and senior news editor here at WDET. He brought us this story on how Metro Detroiters and elected officials are fighting to stop toxic waste from being stored in the Van Buren Township landfill. Quinn, thank you for joining us here this morning.
You are very welcome.
WDET has weathered many changes in government priorities, but we've always had one constant. That's you, our listeners. Now, with looming threats to federal funding, we're asking for your help again. Let's build a stronger WDET together. We're aiming for 1,000 additional members to reinforce our future. Join us at WDET.org/give and spread the word. All right, later this hour, Michigan landfills are nearing capacity. Where will your trash go when they're full? And up next, a mix-up in the clerk's office in Detroit is going to make it a little bit harder to join and be elected to the community advisory councils. The Detroit documenters will break it all down. This is the Metro. Stay right there. Welcome back to the Metro. I'm Cary Junior II in for Robin Vincent. Last year, Michigan residents created 24 million tons of solid waste. When we throw away all of that trash, what even happens to it? Obviously, we empty our garbage into a bin outside, and then that's picked up by the waste management company. And then the materials are all dumped into this landfill. And for most of us, that's really all we know and all we need to know. It sits in a pile on the ground somewhere far away from us. But for some, it's not so far away. And for those folks, that waste can be harmful to their environment. So how does the landfill try to prevent those impacts? How does a landfill actually work? Carol Miller is a professor of engineering at Wayne State University. I spoke with her to better understand how landfill sites are built and how they attempt to prevent contaminants from impacting its surrounding areas. All right, Professor Miller, let's start with the basics. How is a landfill site determined?
So to set aside a site to become a landfill and to be regulated, an application has to be made with the local authorities to analyze what the natural conditions are. You know, you don't want to be too close to a natural water body. You don't want to have groundwater that's very close to where the landfill waste is going to be. And you need to look at the community and make sure that there's not an exacerbated risk to the community from the landfill coming in. You also need to do a lot of work looking at transport times. Obviously, one of the costs of getting rid of waste is paying for the trucks and the transportation, the gasoline, all of that all of those sorts of costs. And so siting of a landfill takes into account those sorts of economic considerations. But on the other hand, the closer you are to a large city and large population, there are some downsides. So it's really weighing the positives and negatives.
Once a site is determined, once they say, okay, this is a place that is in appropriate proximity where the travel costs are as minimal as they can be without being too dangerous to nearby communities, and they've tested the ground and decided that this is far enough from bodies of water, what goes into building it to ensure that it's the appropriate material so that it can hold this waste? Because I think when people think of landfills who aren't, like myself, I'll say, who know nothing about them, we think of a big hole in the ground and then there's just a bunch of waste in there.
Yeah, there is more involved. But in general, the idea that you presented is, kind of the starting point for it. So usually a landfill site is a very large piece of property. And rather than, dig a small hole that covers the whole property, what you normally would do is stage it to have deeper cells that take up a relatively small part of the property, in terms of surface area. And you completely fill that particular cell with waste. It may take months, it may take a year, depending on the site and so on. But at the conclusion of when that particular cell is filled, it becomes capped with highly impermeable materials like high density polyethylene and other things. And so it gets capped with a synthetic usually.
Mm-hmm.
And then it also gets capped with a very tight, low permeability clay material or bentonite material. And then after that, it's vegetated so that, plants are growing and removing water that might start to percolate into the cell, because you don't want to be adding a lot of moisture into this.
When you dig into the ground and create this first cell, is there any lining or anything that goes in between the waste and the ground, or is it just placed in there and it's just far enough away where we're hoping that any types of chemical matter that goes into the ground isn't touching anything?
Definitely, when you first excavate that cell, you would need to construct barrier layers at the bottom of the cell, and that would be some of these like plastic layers. And normally you would have like a sandwich layer at the bottom where maybe you'd have a plastic and then a foot of clay, and then another plastic and a foot of clay, and then another plastic, and then your natural soil at the very bottom.
Is there ever a situation where you can build a landfill that could completely eliminate the harms that the waste in it may be seeping into the ground, the harms that waste can create through the ground?
Well, as a scientist, I would say there really is not a way to design one where you would have zero risk of that contamination, because there is always liquid being mixed. As rain comes in, there's fluid being mixed with some of the very nasty stuff that's tossed into the landfill, and it creates what we call leachate. And even though you can design a very, very tight landfill and you can have redundancies in the pipes and in the drainage systems, there certainly is a potential always for a leak.
Mm-hmm. This doesn't sound like the landfill construction that you described doesn't sound like the landfills I've seen before. And whether it be TV or even in some documentaries when they talk about landfills, it's always this open air pile of waste that's creating this giant mountain. I guess my question is, what's the difference between what I've seen and what you're describing?
Well, I think what you've seen often is you've seen one of these massive excavations and it hasn't been completed yet. So what you're seeing is this big pit, and you can actually look into it and see crap in there. One thing is true, that a lot of times once the landfill is complete and it's capped and, you have the vegetation on it, people can drive by it and not even know it's a landfill. But it's also possible that some of the things you're referring to are not regulated landfills. They may be junkyards or things that are not permitted. In that case, they don't have to have all those barriers, because they're not they're kind of doing it outside of the law.
So I want to talk a little bit about how landfills accommodate different kinds of contaminants. Referring to this particular landfill in Van Buren Township, there's the waste management company that uses that landfill, Republic Services. They recently requested expansion of that hazardous waste landfill, and there were protests from residents in that area back in January when the nuclear waste from Palestine, Ohio was dumped there. But the justification is that that facility in Van Buren Township was uniquely equipped to handle the hazardous waste. So I guess I'm wondering, like, what does then this landfill do to accommodate for this hazardous waste that it is not in other areas where they have to then ship that stuff to this particular site?
There are different levels of permitting for landfills. If you have a municipal landfill, it doesn't have as stringent of containment requirements, whereas if it's a hazardous waste landfill, if you're getting a permit for that, it has much more stringent design considerations and containment. Same thing for industrial landfills. And so, the general features of the design would be the same, but the containment features would have to be much more stringent for, let's say, a hazardous waste landfill, where the clay thickness of the barriers would have to be more. You'd have to have more of these synthetic barrier liners. You'd have more redundancy in terms of monitoring wells. We didn't talk about that yet, but one of the items that is required for one of these regulated landfills, whether it's municipal or industrial, is the placement of monitoring wells around the landfill so that the community can keep track of, whether the water quality is changing, the groundwater quality is changing due to the presence of this landfill. So it's a more hazardous landfill would have to have many more of these monitoring wells.
I'd imagine that then these more hazardous landfills, prior to being determined, like before they choose those sites, they might have had gone through a more rigorous process for that too. I know you talk about the proximity to the city, and okay.
One of the things is that for the more hazardous ones, generally there's much stricter requirements on depth to groundwater. So, the bottom of the landfill, what is, the question often is, what is the clear distance between the bottom of the landfill and the point at which you have groundwater aquifers? And you want to have a much larger distance for more hazardous. It's also one reason why you see a lot of the hazardous and nuclear disposal sites out west in very arid areas where the groundwater is very deep. It's deep below the surface. And those are often considered good sites for placing this type of material.
You're listening to The Metro on 101.9 WDET. I'm Cary Junior II, and my guest is Wayne State Engineering Professor Carol Miller. She's explaining to me how landfills actually work to keep our waste contained. Now, Professor Miller, the owners of that hazardous landfill want to expand it. Under what conditions can a landfill be approved to expand?
Yeah, I think when reviewing expansion, you would have to review, once again, sort of the demographics, the population density, because it may have changed from when the original permit was issued. And so if you're looking to expand it, you want to find out what sort of differences have occurred in the region since that permitting. And it could be things like changes in groundwater level or changes in population. There could be other industries nearby that maybe there's some sort of, you just need to really look at it with fresh eyes. Also, if the new material that's coming in is different than what was originally permitted, that also, raises some flags. And you say you got to really check this out a little bit differently now because it's a different type of waste material coming in.
Now, could the opposite occur? Could a landfill be closed or limited if a nearby community expands or increases in population?
Sure. That can happen. Yeah, that can happen. Although usually there are, zoning requirements and offset distances that are in place so that even though the community population would increase, there are limits in terms of the spatial growth extent, because you can't have it get so close to the landfill. But Certainly, I have seen situations where changes in the community or other types of changes in the area have led to decisions of no expansion. And sometimes it's even led to decisions there have been cases of landfills that have had to be excavated and put somewhere else because the location that was designed is leaking too much. So, yeah, it can go in reverse. You can have a deconstruction of a landfill.
For the landfills that have reached capacity, they've been covered, and there's a new use on top of them. I know we've seen some landfills under shopping malls or plazas or parks. How safe are those really, and how do you make those landfills safe enough for folks to then, spend their time literally right on top of it?
Well, that's a great question. And now you're getting into maybe less my scientific answer, but
Sure.
more my human answer. And I guess personally, I would not want to be living on top of a landfill. On the other hand, there are uses of landfills that are very safe, like developing parks. But the reason I don't like buildings or houses is because if gas starts coming up out of the landfill and then you have a confined space, you can have real issues with that. So certainly there have been some developments right on top of landfills, and we sort of do that when we we revitalize brownfields. But in those cases, the site is very well remediated before something is put on top of it, so that you're quite confident that there aren't going to be high pressure gases moving up into your structure. So I would say I've seen it done safely, that is, structures built on landfills, but I think for me the risk is too great.
The idea that landfills are something that it seems like it's just something we have to deal with, we have to manage. Is this something that we'll ever be able to get away from because we consume so much, we waste so much? There will always be landfills?
Well, I'm not sure that there always will be. Well, there will always be some form of landfills. I'll take that back. I think there'll always be some form of landfills. But, of course, there are other ways to get rid of waste, but it's a real question of what is the best way. I mean, you can burn. We've seen problems with incinerators in Detroit and many other locations in the past in terms of impacting air quality. And so, I mean, that's an option. Things that now are going to the landfill may have in the past been incinerated. Incinerators they're more rare these days. But then there's also, really we need to look more into like the circular economy and looking at reusing materials so that there's less of a need for waste space. So just as one idea here is in the Detroit area, Great Lakes Water Authority is looking at taking some of the waste from their wastewater treatment plant and potentially converting it, that waste into fuel, into a diesel fuel. And so rather than taking that waste and incinerating it or taking the waste and putting it in a landfill, is there a way to use the waste and actually get some energy out of it, a useful product out of it? And I think people are spending more time looking at those options.
Professor Carol Miller, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate you being succinct and to the point, and I learned a lot. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
That was my conversation with Professor Carol Miller from Wayne State University about how landfills are made. A quick clarification, the protest to the shipment of waste from East Palestine, Ohio took place in February of 2023. All right, coming up, the Ann Arbor Art Fair is back in a few weeks. We hear about what's old and what's new at this cherished event. This is WDET FM Detroit Public Radio, your connection to news, music, and conversation. And this is The Metro. Stay with us.